What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and this is episode 14 of season 3 of my live streams. This is the episode or vlog or whatever the heck I'm calling it. This is the episode for Friday, April 2nd, 2021. And I've only really got one thing to talk about in any detail today, so I think this is going to be a fairly short stream, but I want to talk briefly about the firmware update, the 1.3 firmware update for the EOS R5 and R6, and I don't know if it was 1.3 for the 1DX, but the three cameras that I just mentioned received firmware updates, and what's in it, whether it's good, bad, what it looks like, etc. So for the R5, the firmware update added the following features. Canon Log 3 was added to the video recording modes. IPB Lite was added to both 4 and 8K recording modes. Previously, I think was only available for previously was, I think, only available for, yeah, I didn't save the thing, but I think it was only available in 1080p. It's now in all four resolutions. It adds raw light for 8K recording. It adds full-time electronic manual focus for certain telephoto lenses. I think right now it's the 70 to 200 and the 100 to 500, but I know the 100 to 500 is on that list, and it has a firmware update too. It includes a time estimate for FTP transfers. It adds 1080p at 120 frames per second high or slow motion recording for, obviously at 1080p. It adds a mode to turn the rear LCD off using the info button. It adds the ability to save camera settings to the secure digital or compact flash or CF Express cards. And then it fixes some problems. It fixes a problem with some CFE cards, or compact CF Express cards not working with the camera properly. It fixes an issue with high-speed continuous shooting not functioning properly, and it fixes a problem where the power may become suspended when using the USB port for power input. So all of this is kind of nice, interesting stuff. Obviously, there's some of the things on this list that I feel should have been in the camera from the start. For example, 120 frame per second recording at 1080p should have been in the camera. It should not have taken so I guess I should just go right into talking. Oh, before I even do that, let me talk about what it didn't fix. I reported to Canon that there was a problem with the EOS R5 when you have it set to retract lenses on power off. So if you have a lens, I don't have one sitting on my desk handy, but I do, for example, the 50 f1.8 STM that's on my 5D that I'm using to record this. It's an overall linear extension lens. So when, actually, perfect example, if you have, this is a old FD lens, but as I focus, hopefully you can see the lens barrel moves in and out. So with an overall linear extension or an overall extension lens, basically what happens is as the lens focuses, it moves the whole lens further away or closer to the sensor. Now, the problem with this is obviously if it's focused at a closer than infinity distance being when it's fully retracted, if it focuses at a closer than infinity distance, it doesn't, or it is pushing out the inner lens barrel, and it subjects it to potential damage. If you bump the lens into something, instead of bumping against the outer lens barrel, which is basically mounted to the lens, mounted to the camera through the lens mount and whatnot, you're pushing the inner lens barrel in against the focusing helical, the focusing motor, etc. On Canon cameras, for many years now, there has been an option to retract these kinds of lenses when you power off the camera. And so example, on my 5D Mark IV, if I have a lens like my 50 f1.8 STM on the camera, when I turn the camera off, it focuses the lens to infinity, which retracts the entire, the focus assembly. It retracts it, and it provides protection for the lens. On the 5D Mark IVs, and every other camera that I've had from Canon that I've had this setting enabled on and have used it with, it only affects lenses that use this focus design. So if you have an internal focusing lens, like, I don't know, this 24-70, it doesn't mess with the focus. It knows, oh, that's an internal focusing lens. Don't do anything, just turn off. If you have a lens that extends, it goes, oh, that's a lens that extends. I need to focus to infinity, which is essentially all it's doing, and then turn off. So the bug that I found in the EOS R5, and I've reported this to Canon, is that it focuses, if you have this setting enabled, it focuses every lens to infinity when you turn the camera off. Does not matter if it's a linear, overall extending lens or an internal focus lens. And of course, the result of this is that if you're shooting with internal focus lenses that don't need this, it messes up the focus every time you turn off the camera. So if you're setting up for, say, night photography, a night landscape or whatever, and you're focusing at infinity, before something interesting happens, or you're not focusing at infinity, you're focusing at, well, actually, even if you are focusing at infinity, because the way Canon designs their lenses, infinity focus floats for thermal expansion reasons, and the lenses will actually focus beyond infinity, and fully retracted is actually focused beyond infinity, so I should have been more clear about that. But anyway, if you're, say, focusing at infinity and you turn the camera off, it will retract the lens the tiny bit, and it doesn't have to be an awful lot, but it's now focused beyond infinity and it blurs the stars. And so with the R5, at least, I have found it does this with every lens if that setting's on. Now, obviously, you can work around the problem by turning the setting off. And then you just have to remember to manually retract all of your overall extending lenses or not use any, which, I don't know, that's sort of a reasonable, or sort of a possible workaround, I guess, too, is just not using overall extending lenses, use internal focusing lenses, I guess, or something like that. It's not ideal. Anyway, I reported this to Canon. I had tested it on the EF 24-70-2.8, the EF 24-105 f4, the EF 16-35 f4, and I've now tested it on my RF 24-70 f2.8. All of them focus past to the shortest focus position, which is past infinity, if the setting's on. So unfortunately, either not enough people reported this to Canon, or Canon has decided that the new behavior of extending lenses on power off is to do this for all lenses or whatever. But if you were hoping to see it fixed in 1.3, if you noticed this problem, it hasn't been fixed in firmware 1.3, which is something I think is a bit unfortunate. Okay, so with that out of the way, going back to what I was starting to talk about, which is I actually wanted to talk about, what's going on with the firmware to a certain extent. There's some nice things added. Like I said, 1080p 120 should have been in the camera from the start. Honestly, I would say the same thing about RAW, or at least IPB light for all of the recording modes, possibly RAW light for the 8K RAW modes, and probably saving camera settings to SD cards. Quite honestly, and I know this is a bit tangential, but quite honestly, these cameras now are so complex that if you happen to have two cameras, two 5D Mark, well, two R5s or two 1DXs or two R6s even, and you want to synchronize the settings between them, it is a tremendous pain in the rear if that process for you means stepping through every menu item, manually changing it on each camera. This is something that this functionality, saving and reloading cards from, or saving and loading camera settings from a card, is a function that Canon has previously had in their Pro bodies, in the 1DX, or yeah, the 1Ds and the 1DXs, but even going back to my 1D Mark III from more than a decade ago had the ability to do this. And it's something to me that makes so much sense. And given how Canon places the R5 or the 5D, I don't understand why it's not there, because, you know, quite honestly, they're placed as professional cameras, and they do things that an EOS, a 1D can't do. A 35 mega or a 45 megapixel EOS R5 is a better landscape camera, in my opinion, or a 30 megapixel 5D Mark IV is a better landscape photographer's Canon than a 1DX Mark III at 20 megapixels. Just my opinion. If you're a professional and you're shooting landscapes, personally, I'd rather be using the 5D Mark IV or the 5DS, or preferably an R5 above all of those, given the image qualities of the cameras. But I don't, like I said, I don't understand why this, especially now, given the capability or the complexity of all these cameras, it's not just something that's in the camera. And honestly, it's something that shouldn't be. One of the gripes that I've had in the past is you couldn't use it to go from camera model to camera model. It's like a binary file. It's specific to the firmware. It's specific to the camera. So you can't, like, this is something I think Canon should really expand out to be some kind of interoperable file format. So like XML or something like that, that you can save your R5 settings, and when you buy your R5 Mark II, just drop them in the camera, and it'll set all of the settings that can be set to the settings that you used to have. But anyway, where I wanted to go with this, though, is I wanted to talk a little bit how I think this sort of lets a window, these firmwares, and especially the problem that Canon had with the R6's 1.3 firmware, to me, it lets a little bit of a window into maybe what's going on, how Canon's engineering sort of works. So, as I said before, there's a whole bunch of features in the camera, and I actually sat down and I went through looking at the features, in the R5 firmware and the R6 firmware, and I looking at what's what. So, for example, adding C-Log 3. Okay, there's no reason the R6 can't have C-Log and C-Log 3. I think it has C-Log. I don't know. I haven't spent that much time looking into the R6 because I don't own one. But I could see where Canon could want to treat this as an R5 specific feature. So the R5 firmware has C-Log 3, the R6 firmware doesn't. Okay, I can see adding IPB light to 8K and raw light to 8K. So the R6 can't shoot 8K. So anything 8K just doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant to the R6. Firmware 1.3 adds IPB light to 4K footage in the R6. So, there's some feature parity there. It's not quite the same because some things are specific to the R5 versus stuff that the R6 just can't do. Both cameras got electronic full-time manual focus. Okay, that makes sense. Both cameras got FTP transfer time estimates. Okay, that makes sense. Adds 1080p 120 to the camera. The R6 apparently already had that. I might be wrong, but they didn't add it to the R6, so it's only getting added to one camera, and I know the R6 can shoot 120 frame per second video, so if I'm wrong, then this is just kind of an example of, like, I have a hard time saying this is a good point for feature differentiation. It doesn't make sense to me that, you know, the lowest resolution these cameras shoot at 120 frames per second is a feature that you would have in the high-end camera but wouldn't have in the low-end camera. Now, as I said, I'm super happy to have this because I don't do a lot of 4K work right now. Shooting high or slow-mo footage in 4K and then down resing it to 1080p so that it doesn't take up a massive pile of space on my computer, and I only needed it in 1080p, kind of like, just, it's easier to do it in 1080p from the start. There is a bigger point, though, here, too, which, stepping away from comparing the firmwares or whatever, hang on a second, just making a note. There's this actually, to me, as a whole, is an interesting window into possibly how Canon's thinking about things. Because I don't understand why you wouldn't just provide as many of the options as you can. Same thing goes back to IPB light for 4 and 8K and raw light for 8K. Now, I can maybe understand raw light, maybe, but being able to pick a bit rate for H.264 and H.265, it makes no sense to me why you would say, okay, well, we can do IPB light for 1080p, but if you're shooting 4K or 8K, you wouldn't use that, or we're not going to include that, even though maybe people won't, it's not something a lot of people will want to use. Obviously, like, the hardware obviously should be able to do it, because basically all it's doing is setting bit rates for the encoders, and the hardware encoder, you know, should be able to handle lower bit rates without a problem. And so it's almost like there's a thought process here of the hardware can do something, but we're not, and obviously the hardware can handle it, and obviously it's not a problem because it's now available in this firmware in 1.3. But there's like this thought process of, obviously we can do it with the hardware, but instead of putting the functionality in for people to have and choose to use or not, we're just going to omit it in places because we don't have enough imagination to imagine that people might want to use it. I mean, it doesn't make the UI any simpler. Choosing between raw IPB, or raw all-eye IPB and IPB light, those 4 buttons essentially are in the screen regardless. They're just disabled if and grayed out if that mode wasn't available. So it didn't make things smaller or easier or less stuff on the screen to not have it. You know, like, I could see making an argument. Well, okay, nobody shooting 4K or 8K are probably going to use IPB light, so we won't have it, and that will make it one less thing that's on the screen, so it simplifies things, so it's a little bit more accessible or approachable or user-friendly or whatever you want to say. But it didn't, the button is still there. So I don't understand why there would be that difference. The same thing goes with turning the monitor or the rear display off using the info button. So now on the R5, it now will actually act almost like you can make it act like a DSLR. So you have no screens on the camera using power. Now I'd like to do some testing on this to see how much power the camera actually burns, but you can have the viewfinders off, the rear screens off. Now, yes, you could, prior to this firmware, you could flip the screen around and close it, and then the camera would always drive the viewfinder. With this, you can actually have the camera where when you take it away from your eye, it turns off the viewfinder, so that's not using power, and it doesn't turn the rear screen on, so that's 1, not using power, and 2, it's not putting out light that's potentially distracting if you're in a dark environment where you don't want to annoy people, like say a piano recital or something like that, where you don't want to annoy people with all of a sudden this bright light shows up that's the screen on your camera. So I think this is a great feature. In fact, it was something I noticed immediately when I picked the camera up, when I first got my R5, that it didn't have it, and I didn't understand why, because it felt like it should have been there. Like it felt just like a missing thing. But again, going back to, as far as I can tell, this isn't available in the R6. It wasn't added in firmware 1.3. And that leaves me, and I don't think it was there previously, but then maybe I'm wrong, but then this still opens up the same question, which is, why is there a difference here? Why adding this function? Now, I know what some people in Canon would probably say, which is something to the effect of, well, nobody was asking for it, so we didn't add it. You know, people with the R5 were asking for it through CPS or the feedback or whatever, so we added it, but people with the R6 weren't asking for it. And my response to that is, that's really just a bad response. I mean, the not adding it to both cameras means you have divergent code path or divergent code bases. And I don't see it, like, I don't see it being a function or feature that should differentiate the product. You know, like, oh, well, the R6 is better than, or the R5 is better because it can do this, and the R6, I mean, you know, there's things that differentiate products that are meaningful differentiations. Like 8K video is a meaningful differentiation, or 45 megapixels is a meaningful differentiation. And then there's other things that are just completely, like, I don't really think that companies are like Canon or Nikon or Sony or whatever are honestly going, this is something that we have to include to differentiate two of our products, because somebody won't buy an EOS R5 because they can turn the screen off with the info button and they'll save the money and they'll buy an R6. No, people are buying R6s because they don't need a 45 megapixel camera, or they don't have the budget for a almost $4,000 camera. Not because you can turn the screen off with the info button. So, like, put it there. The same thing goes with saving camera settings to the card. Okay, I understand Canon feels that this is a pro-level feature and blah, 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 blah. Like, you know, but again, with the complexity of these cameras, I think it's really time that not only do most higher-end digital cameras should have this capability, but it should be taken the next step into, if you upgrade, you should be able to port your settings from your old camera to your new camera by saving them to the card and then importing most, if not all, of those settings. I mean, obviously, new settings will stay as defaults, and settings that no longer exist won't be set. But just importing them into the new camera. Like, when I got my second 5D Mark IV, it took 20 or 30 minutes at least for me to go through and set every setting in the camera so that my new camera and my old camera had, so I had two 5D Mark IVs. Both of them had the identical setup. Now, obviously, it diverges as I do things, again, change settings on one and not the other, but just getting them to the same baseline, these are my major settings, this is the starting point. Like, I shouldn't have to fight with that. So, fixing the problems, fixing the problem with the R5 with CF Express cards. Obviously, the R6 doesn't have CF Express slots, so this is very obviously something the R5 would have to deal with. You know, that I could understand that it's hardware specific and there's one hardware in one camera that's not in the other. Okay. General bug fixes. Of the, I think, of the four other total bug fixes, 2 were on both cameras, so the high-speed continuous shooting and the USB power delivery problem. Both cameras had those. Both cameras got fixes for those. The R6 got a fix for problems that, a problem that may corrupt the image displayed in the viewfinder. Now, yes, the R5 and the R6 have different viewfinders. The R5's viewfinder is higher resolution than the R6's. The R6's is the same resolution as the EOS R. But my question is what is Canon doing differently that allows this to be a problem? The viewfinders, like, this is one of those things that should somewhat be abstracted, and okay, maybe they're using viewfinder OLED panels or whatever from a third party, probably Sony, maybe, I don't know. And they're different, so there's slightly different code bases. So, okay, you know, in retrospect, now that I think about it, this is a question of different hardware has different responses. Okay, fine. The last one is, so the story with firmware 1.3 for the EOS R6 is that it was released. Within 24 hours, it was pulled, and then today it was re-released as 1.3.1. And the reason it was pulled is that there was a problem that was discovered that if you were shooting 4K 120 video, I think in EFS crop mode or movie crop mode, it would cause the camera to lock up, and the only way you could restart the camera was to pull the battery, and then you had to switch it to photo mode, and then you had to clear the camera settings, and then you had to reset all your settings in it. Didn't brick your camera to the point that you had to, like, as far as I know, didn't brick the camera to the point that you had to send it to camera, but Canon, but real pain in the rear. Now, one of the first things I did when I got this on my R5 was start playing around with 1080p shooting at 120 frames per second, and discovered, hey, look, I can shoot it in crop mode. I don't have to shoot everything in full frame. Okay, that's cool. I can, like, there's a use for this. This is neat. Didn't have any problems. And as far as I can tell, nobody's reporting an issue with this, with high speed 1080p 120 in camera or in movie crop mode, causing a problem with the camera on the R5. So the question I ask is, again, what's the difference? Yeah, the sensors aren't the same. Okay. But the cameras as a whole, like, Canon designs these sensors. So the camera, the interface from the camera to the sensor, they should be designing these to be fairly similar. And by what I mean fairly similar is, yes, there's more data coming, or no, you know, yes, there's, you know, less resolution or whatnot, but there shouldn't be such a difference in how it talks to the sensor that you have these wildly diverging code paths. Again, why is the functionality in one camera and not the other when they both can shoot 1080p video? And we're talking like lowest common denominator, not highest common denominator. Like, I understand why the R5 can't shoot 8K, but I don't understand why both cameras don't have exact feature sets or identical feature sets at 1080p, given the capabilities of the cameras. So what did Canon mess up, fine, tweak, I don't even know, that broke crop 1080p 120 on the R6, but didn't break it on the R5? Because it works fine on the R5, and as like I said, I haven't seen any reports of people having problems with the R5 locking up when shooting 120 frame per second video at movie crop mode on the R5. In fact, I've been doing a lot of that since I got the firmware update. And like I said, this is, it seems to me like I mean, I understand certain features are, certain functionality is or isn't going to be there due to hardware. And I understand that certain functionality isn't going to be there due to change, like product differentiation. But then there's some functionality in here that makes no sense as a for product differentiation. And there's bug fixes that don't readily make sense with respect to hardware. In fact, even that high frame rate shooting bug fix on the R6 doesn't really make sense with respect to hardware, because to recover the camera after it happened, you cleared all the settings on the camera and then it would work fine. You have to reset everything up, and you obviously wouldn't want to start shooting high frame rate video, but I mean, that seemed to fix the problem. That's not a sensor issue, a hardware issue, that's a code issue in the firmware. And either that should have affected the other cameras, or at least the R5, or like I said, I don't quite understand why it's there. And it seems to me like what this is really kind of hinting at from an engineering perspective is that maybe there isn't a unified code base inside of Canon for these cameras, or maybe they're being worked on by different teams, or I mean, I don't know, I'm speculating, but I'm having a hard time coming up with compelling reasons to believe, like, not to see why. I mean, other than maybe it's some Japanese cultural company thing, or corporate culture thing, or whatever, but I'm having a hard time coming up with a reason to see why, like, adding the info button display off thing doesn't sort of immediately populate out to firmware updates to, I mean, obviously they'd have to release the firmware update, but like a firmware update for the R5 and the R6 and whatever, all of that shared common code base, firmware it gets implemented, it gets tested, everything gets it within, next firmware update kind of thing. Like, it should show up in the R6 and the R5 and whatever else. At least to me, that seems like what it should do. But it really kind of, in some respects, seems like they fork a code base, and now they have the R5 branch and they have the R6 branch, and they either fix things independently and maybe port certain, like if it's a bug fix that shows up in both cameras, maybe they port that. But I don't know, it's weird, and it doesn't seem like, it seems like they could do this way easier, way more effectively in I don't know. Like I said, it just seems weird to me from a software engineering perspective that there isn't a more coherent, fluid, like, from a cost perspective, it would make a ton of sense in sort of cutting costs to make the firmwares less specific to each camera and more of a specific general purpose thing. So obviously you're not going to necessarily like do the Windows or Mac OS thing where you have a driver for this and a driver for that and software doing this and software doing that. As I said in a previous video, firmwares for cameras have to be really tight. There's really tight timing demands. You can't just, it's hard real time. You can't just sort of go, well, I'm gonna stop and worry about, stop worrying about your picture and I'm gonna go worry about doing something else. Too bad your picture's exposure's wrong, or whatever. Like, that doesn't work. But on the same token, when you're building the code base, you can build it in such a way that I don't want to say as libraries, but you could build it almost as libraries, where you isolate the code for things like the sensor or the viewfinder or the CF Express card slot, and you pull in the bits that you need, but everything from in a broader sense is working with roughly the same or the same APIs. Or so you write a feature or function like turning off the rear display with the info button. You put it in the general code base of the camera, and when you build the next firmware update, that just is included. Now, maybe you flag it so that, like on DSLRs, it doesn't get included because it's kind of already there. I mean, because you can, if you hit the info button on a 5D, for example, it steps through pretty much all of the same things an R5 does, including turning off the rear LCD. It's just not an explicit page, you know, or thing that you can enable or disable. But it's almost like that code is already probably in there, and it wasn't being exposed on the mirrorless cameras for arbitrary reasons or something. I don't know. If you are an R5 or R6 user, check out firmware 1.3, especially if you're an R5 user. It does add some useful stuff. Maybe not if you're a still photographer purely, but certainly as a video photographer. It seems like it's been stable for me on the R5, so but it seems like it's a reasonable incremental update. It's certainly not the big jump that, you know, maybe we would all hope that Canon would put out, but it's enough of a jump in places that, you know, there's stuff I'd still like to see Canon add. I hope that Canon continues with the idea of releasing incremental firmware updates to add, you know, functionality to the camera over the life of the camera, or at least kind of does the 7D thing where, like, halfway through its life they put out a big firmware update that does a whole bunch of new stuff if they can. It's certainly one of those things that's the hardware is there. You know, it's now kind of tweaking the software and making the software a little bit better. But anyway, yeah, definitely worth checking out 1.3, especially if you're a video shooter. I think that's a good move. You will, I think, need to update Digital Photo Pro and EOS Utility if those are stuff that you use to talk to the camera or process images. They're also available on Canon's website now. Digital Photo Pro, you are probably better off updating it from within the app than from trying to download it, because it's easier. But anyway, that's all I got for today, and yep, it looks like it's going to be a reasonably short, well, it's certainly not a 2-hour plus long episode, but 40 minutes is not horrible. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe. If you've had a problem, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. Especially, well, if you've had a problem with the EOS R5's firmware update, you know, feel free to leave a comment, let me know. Do the usual YouTube things, like, you know, whatever, that stuff. I know you guys all know how to do that, I hope. So yeah, anyway, like I said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.